Two teens are slayed in the 60s and 70s. Their perpetrator seems to have gotten away with it, until almost 60 years later, when detectives connect them through DNA and name the faceless monster that took their lives. 19-year-old Diane Olkwitz in 1966 and 15-year-old Terri Lee Erdmann in 1971 were taken mercilessly from their parents. The two teens lost their lives 5 years apart, taken 2 miles from each other. But decades later, police would dig up the truth, literally, exhuming their assailant to gather DNA. The fourth child of a Catholic family with 6 children, Diane Olkwitz was born in 1947 in Menominee Falls, Wisconsin. This family was incredibly busy in their cozy house on Hayes Avenue, a block from St. Mary Catholic Church, where they were parishioners. Diane's elder siblings, Dennis, Edward, and Nancy, adored her. The younger ones, Patty and Debbie, equally loved their big sister. Diane was the quintessential middle child, loving and caring, doting. She was sensitive but an extrovert and loved to be out and about. Diane was a tall, slender brunette with a quick wit and a bright smile. By the time she finished high school, she had blossomed into a young woman of grace and charm. Regular visits to St. Mary's Church were a part of Diane's routine, a sanctuary where she sought solace and guidance. Whenever she faced challenges or uncertainties, she would turn to prayer, finding comfort in her faith. In matters of the heart, Diane approached relationships with sincerity. While she dated casually during high school and even had a few steady boyfriends, it was not until after graduation that she found a deeper connection. Meeting Donald Heirlmeyer from Milwaukee sparked a romance that would eventually lead to engagement. As she ventured into adulthood, Diane also chose a path typical for ambitious young girls at the time. Securing a secretarial position at Kenworth Manufacturing, she had a diligent work ethic. After a year of employment, Diane felt ready to take the next step in her journey. It was time to fly the coop, so to speak. With her brother Edward's girlfriend as her roommate, Diane moved into her own apartment on Hoyt Drive. Amidst the changes and milestones in her life, Diane stood by her dear friend Diane Zimmer as she chose another path and got married. Zimmer and Diane had been in the same school since elementary school, but became best friends in freshman year. Serving as maid of honor at Zimmer's wedding, who married her longtime high school sweetheart, marked yet another chapter in their shared history. Her fiancé, Donald Heirlmeyer, attended as her +1. Shortly after, Donald left for basic training at Fort Hood, Texas, as he had been drafted into the Army. Diane felt a deep sense of loneliness without him by her side. To fill the void left by his absence, she sought out activities to occupy her time and distract her from the ache in her heart. In the evenings, Diane enrolled in swimming and knitting classes, embracing the opportunity to learn new skills and engage in social interactions. Additionally, she took on a part-time job as a hostess at the local Dutchland Dairy restaurant, eagerly immersing herself in the bustling atmosphere to pass the hours. On November 3, 1966, Diane went about her day as usual. Patty, her younger sister, vividly recalls reaching out to Diane in hopes of borrowing a blue mohair sweater for a sleepover planned that night. Without hesitation, Diane generously agreed, promising to leave the sweater outside her apartment door for Patty to collect. Diane worked at 13700 block of West Silver Spring Drive at the metal stamping plant of Kenworth Manufacturing Company. By now, she had worked at the company for a year and a half, marking 18 months with them. She was dedicated. That day, the building was busy with activity, as 25 factory workers carried out their weekend shifts, which concluded promptly at 3:30 p.m. Amidst the industrious setting, Diane stood out as the sole secretary. She was responsible for managing communications and coordinating deliveries. After the factory workers left for the day, Diane remained behind, working away at her desk until 4:30 p.m. Her duties extended beyond the typical work hours, as she dutifully fielded phone calls and accepted late deliveries. Following her shift, Diane would typically rendezvous with her best friend Zimmer at her nearby workplace. Together, they would head home, sharing laughter and companionship along the way. However, that day, something was definitely off. Diane was unusually late in picking up Zimmer, worrying for those who knew her well. In response, Zimmer accepted a ride with her employer's wife, who offered to take her to Kenworth to investigate. Upon arriving at the factory, they were confused. Diane's car sat in the parking lot, seemingly undisturbed. Peering through the window into the plant, they spotted Diane's purse resting on a desk and her coat hanging near the closet. Yet Diane herself was nowhere to be found. To add to the mystery, all the doors were securely locked, leaving no clues as to Diane's whereabouts. Maybe she was in the bathroom. Dennis, her brother, worked in the plant next door, so Zimmer and the boss's wife walked over to him. The trio returned just in time for the supervisor to show up for some after-hour tasks. He came to unlock the shipping room around 5:20 p.m., and that is when they saw all the blood. 20 feet from the door was the lifeless body of Diane, face down on the floor in her own blood. She had been stabbed so many times. Her knit dress was pulled up between her legs, slightly hanging off her shoulders, but her underwear was untouched. So initially, the officers believed she had not been assaulted. There was no appearance of aggression or violence near her private parts. But the medical examiner reported it was not so. An autopsy revealed that she had been stabbed 106 times with a knife that likely had a 3-inch blade with one sharp serrated edge. Her wounds measured were between 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch wide and from 2 to 3 inches deep. Initially, she had put up a fight and tried to block the painful attack, as there were defensive wounds on her arms and the back of her hands. The attacker had bashed her nose, breaking it. There were 30 stab wounds on her head, neck, and face, and 35 stabbings in rows down the sides of her back, where she had been stabbed repeatedly while on her stomach. Diane's tragedy sent shockwaves through the once peaceful village of Menominee Falls, leaving its residents full of disbelief. In all of the village's history, such a violent act was unmatched. It was the first recorded slaying in the serene community at the northwestern city limits of Milwaukee. Just months prior to Diane's untimely tragedy, the slaying of a 10-year-old girl in Milwaukee had cast a shadow of fear over the region. Debbie, her younger sister, was scared because the girl was so close to Debbie in age. But Diane, with a reassuring smile, had said, "We are fine. We live in Menominee Falls." In the aftermath of Diane's attack, the town changed forever. Fear gripped the hearts of residents. They bought guard dogs, chain locks, and firearms as they struggled with the new feeling of vulnerability in their once safe town. At Diane's funeral mass held at St. Mary's, grief hung heavy in the air, as 250 mourners, including her devastated fiancé Donald Hirlmeyer, gathered to bid farewell. Donald, granted emergency leave from basic training, was still reeling from the shock of the tragic loss. In an attempt to catch the perpetrator as soon as possible, Diane's friends, family, and acquaintances were questioned on the night her body was recovered. Patrolman Dan Schramm's first year as a police officer started off with something huge. He was assigned to remain at the site of the crime to overlook comings and goings. As spooked as he was, there was nothing to fear. Nobody came to look at things again. He would retire as a captain 26 years later, but nothing could match the horrors of the Diane Olkwitz case. The investigation into Diane's slaying unfolded to give a better picture of the events leading to her tragic demise. Police surmised that the assailant ambushed Diane as she prepared to lock up and leave for the day, catching her off guard when she was all alone after hours. Their suspicions deepened as they contemplated the intruder's familiarity with the layout of the plant. It suggested that there was planning involved in targeting Diane. Then Chief of the Menominee Falls Police Department, Charles Kuhn, offered a sobering deduction, saying that Diane's assailant was not a faceless stranger, but rather someone she knew. This unsettling revelation cast a shadow of suspicion over friends, acquaintances, and associates, heightening the sense of unease within the tight-knit community. A team of dedicated detectives committed themselves to working day and night. The 7 detectives worked tirelessly through grueling 12 to 16-hour shifts without rest. Over 100 crucial pieces of evidence, including fingerprints retrieved from the crime scene and Diane's blood-stained garments, were meticulously cataloged and dispatched to the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. In the ensuing weeks, law enforcement officers interrogated all possible leads. They conducted over 500 interviews in search of the truth. Despite their exhaustive efforts, their pursuit was fruitless. Initially, 6 people were marked as potential suspects, each with solid alibis firmly in place. Diane's family and close confidants steered investigators towards a troubling figure lurking at her workplace. The son of her boss, whose persistent advances had made her incredibly uncomfortable. She was almost afraid of him. Recounting Diane's hesitance, her sister Patty vividly recalled her distressing encounters with the unwanted suitor. He knew she was committed, but that did not stop him. Yet even as suspicions swirled around the employer's son, he had a steadfast alibi, corroborated by family members. As the trail of leads grew cold and the promise of breakthroughs faded, the investigation lost its momentum. With each passing day, Diane's unsolved case went cold. Donald Hirlmeyer, her fiancé, returned to basic training heartbroken, with questions that would never be answered. Diane's parents both passed young, their health deteriorating under the strain of their daughter's slaying. Her mother, Irene, had been diagnosed with diabetes shortly before the terrible night she lost her daughter. She passed away of congestive heart failure at 50 years old in 1973. One would say she could not bear losing her daughter. Her father, Robert, suffered a heart attack at 55, 3 years later. Diane's eldest sister, Nancy, passed at 58, and her brother Dennis, who tirelessly pursued justice for Diane, suffered a stroke at 50, and he too was lost 12 years later. In 1966, Menominee Falls police sent a questionnaire to delivery companies that had contacts with Kenworth. Company records show that your company makes deliveries here, and we request your cooperation in answering the following questions and returning this paper to our department immediately. Your cooperation will be of vital assistance in solving this crime. One company responded, saying the man picked something up from Kenworth 4 days before the tragedy. The man would have been familiar with the scene of the Diane Olkwitz case. It is unclear whether this lead was pursued. In the 1990s, DNA technology raised hopes for solving Diane's case. Despite entering evidence into CODIS and pursuing suspects for DNA samples, no matches were found. The prime suspect, the employer's son, had passed away in 1991, and his cremated remains could not provide a sample. Initially, detectives believed this was a position that offers no hope of progress. While the case remained open, it was simply a formality. But they did not realize the assailant was lurking nearby, looking for new prey. Terri Lee Erdmann was described as a quiet, reserved girl with a great sense of humor. The middle child of 3 siblings, she had 2 brothers, Daryl and Daniel. But being the only daughter in the family, she got extra attention from her parents. Terri's father worked as a switchman for the Milwaukee Road. Their life was comfortable. Her mother, Lois May Christian, was employed in fabric stores and J.C. Penney's. She often went bowling with her husband in couples leagues. The family loved spending time together at their cottage in Tomahawk, Wisconsin. Terri had a loving family. The 15-year-old had just finished 9th grade at Samuel Morse Junior High School. She was going to enroll in James Madison High School during fall in September of 1971. On Wednesday, 23 June 1971, she left home somewhere around 5 p.m. She was going to babysit in the neighborhood. She normally left a note when she left, and it was usually on a Wednesday, but she did not do it this time. Her family just assumed it slipped her mind. But by 9:30 p.m., they were worried. They asked the neighbors and called around. She had spent the afternoon with friends near North 95th and West Rio Streets, laughing and chatting until the sky turned a shade of purple. Terri set off for home, opting for the well-trodden path that cut through the open field. It was a shortcut she knew well that shaved minutes off her walk to their home on the 10400 block of West Silver Spring Drive. That was the last anyone knew of her. The next day, 11-year-old Robert Sonier was walking in the woods with his father, Walter. The woods were right behind a Moorway department store in the 10100 block of West Appleton Avenue. This particular area of woods was called Lover's Lane, as it was secluded, and teen couples often parked their cars there to get intimate, as suggested by the name. As they walked through the dense bushes, Robert saw something odd. It looked like a person lying on the ground, in the thicket of trees and small grass. He first thought perhaps it was a couple, but then noticed it was a girl all alone. He realized it was a lifeless body of a girl. The 15-year-old was stabbed over 60 times. Her arms were tied with twine. Her blue shorts and underwear had been pulled down, and her jersey sweater was pulled over her face, suggesting she had been assaulted. According to Officer Robert Schultz, she had been stabbed aggressively. Late that night, around 12:30 a.m., her father was brought in to identify her body at the county morgue. Terri's 1971 case is the 3rd oldest unsolved case at the Milwaukee Police Department. Police exhausted all possible leads, and nothing could be said about whether or not she would get justice. Her family was never the same again. In 2011, DNA was taken from Terri's autopsy, and it was identified as male DNA. Detectives suspected the same person committed both of the slayings of Diane and Terri due to case similarities. Firstly, the distance between the cases. It happened around 1.5 miles from each other. Also, both victims were teenage girls, so it did match the profile he must have set in his mind for the ideal victim. Both of them were stabbed. It was highly aggressive, as if in a frenzy, even as the life had drained from the body. Lastly, there was evidence of intimate assault, which provided a motive for such a heinous crime. A joint request was placed at the Wisconsin Crime Lab to compare the DNA profiles to each other. The Wisconsin Crime Lab then confirmed that the DNA profiles from both victims were consistent. The DNA could not be matched to a suspect, so the case went cold again. In October of 2021, Menominee Falls detective Chris Bellows met with the staff of the State of Wisconsin Crime Laboratory about the use of forensic investigative genetic genealogy, which had been developed in 2019. Then, in February of 2023, through investigative efforts that utilized forensic investigative genetic genealogy, a potential suspect was identified. Clarence Tappendorf was a delivery driver in 1966 for Claremont Transfer Company, whose route included Kenworth. There were no deliveries scheduled on the date of Diane's demise. 4 days before her slaying, he picked up a delivery according to the questionnaires Menominee Falls PD had given out during the initial investigation. He would have basic knowledge of the layout of the building, and the fact that Diane would be alone 3:30 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. On the day Diane lost her life, Tappendorf made a delivery to a location across the street from Kenworth Company. Tappendorf, a man whose life spanned 80 years, had already passed away on January 6, 2008. Investigators reached out to the late Tappendorf's 2 adult sons, and one of them agreed to provide a DNA sample. They compared his DNA to the profiles from both cases and discovered that the DNA found on Diane Olkwitz's clothing likely belonged to Tappendorf, their father. Police then obtained a search warrant to exhume Tappendorf's body from Holy Cross Cemetery in Milwaukee to collect DNA samples for further analysis. Tappendorf was a devoted husband to Joyce for 57 years, a loving father to his 6 children, 6 grandchildren, and great-grandfather of many. As wonderful as he sounds, this family man was a positive match for the perpetrator's DNA, as announced in October 2023. He would have been 39 years old when he took Diane's life, and 44 when he attacked little Terri Lee. But it makes one wonder, especially considering what happened to him later. At the age of 17 years, his daughter's life was taken from her. A young man was charged with battery and abuse, causing her demise. Hattie Jo Tappendorf was found beaten lifeless on a sidewalk on 1 August 1975, just 2 blocks from her home. This was in 1975, 4 years after Tappendorf's last reported attack. The perpetrator was identified as Roy Clark O'Neill, 18 years old. His parents turned him over to the police after viewing a television report that showed a watch found at the scene of the slaying. The suspect told authorities that he had taken LSD and had been drinking. He was convicted of second-degree slaying and sentenced to 38 years in prison. Then Tappendorf's son passed away in 1987. His wife, Joyce, had to face the unbearable pain of losing a child to a violent fate all over again. On Friday, May 22, 1987, their 34-year-old son, Mark, took his own life in what police determined to be a slaying. Mark shot his wife, Linda, 34, in the head with a hunting rifle before turning the weapon on himself early Friday morning in their South Side home. The bodies were discovered by their 15-year-old daughter around 7 a.m. The couple's daughter and son had slept through the ordeal. Joyce reflected on the tragedy, struggling to comprehend why such sorrow had struck her family again. She described her son as a deeply troubled person, unable to understand why he had also taken Linda's life. But this could offer another explanation. Perhaps there was an undiagnosed illness, a mental illness, for both the father and the son. Debbie Cagliari, Diane's sister, thanked the detectives for their hard work and dedication to solve Diane's case. Debbie was only 9 when Diane had passed. It took 57 years to bring the family closure, but they were finally able to bury the whole thing and leave it behind. Her niece even appeared for an interview. She said the following to families of other cold case victims: "Do not give up. Do not give up. You cannot give up hope. You have to keep it going." Norman Gross, a former classmate of Diane, said he never gave up hope that her perpetrator would eventually be revealed. Just going to class reunions and stuff, her name was always there. She is always on your mind. All these years, and finally it has come to a conclusion. Attorney General Josh Kaul said, "It saddens me that the person responsible was not able to be brought to justice while he was alive. But I am glad that we were able to bring closure to this case through the relentless academic investigators and scientists to ensure that the person responsible was identified." Chief Jeffrey Norman said, "I know there are families out there wondering about their case. There is no statute of limitations regarding a slaying investigation. We are working on it, whether it is 5 years, 10 years, 70 years, to bring closure, to bring the resolution to these most heinous crimes." Despite the tragic losses and the years of anguish, the truth was uncovered, allowing the families to finally begin to heal. While some would say Tappendorf got away with it, it is almost bizarre how he suffered in his life. At least through DNA genetic genealogy, the families of the victims had some answers as to who would do something so gruesome. As to why, well, that answer lies buried with Clarence Tappendorf. Investigators say they are looking into the possibility that Tappendorf could be responsible for more crimes.